I was, I think, asked to address this first question. To what extent do language models offer hypotheses about human minds produce natural language texts? And an obvious answer that immediately appealed to me when I was thinking about this, well, that all depends on how one thinks human minds produce natural language. And I think that therefore means that to some people, LLMs must seem, well, the standard reaction seems to be, oh no, it doesn't work like that. From my own perspective, you know, the class I was teaching before this started, I conceived of about 10 years ago as a way of working on an alternative view of human communication. And to my surprise, these days, what I can say to students is from the principles they'll learn in that class, they'll at least understand how an LLM works. And so I'm going to start that as a sort of background to this talk, because I started thinking about alternative ways of language working, basically coming out of my main research interests, which were various things to do with how children learn language, and in particular, how people learn, say, categorization and things. And so, you know, there's a traditional answer to this question, which takes a view of language working as compositional codes in which words convey meanings, that larger meanings are going to be built out of inventories of smaller units. I think Bob once said that if linguistics is about anything, it's about categorization and figuring out the categories that we build things out of. Having spent the early part of my career studying categorization, that didn't make a lot of sense to me because you always have this problem of defining units that seem in some ways to be continuous. And a sort of way I thought about introducing the ideas today is that a lot of linguistic assumptions are nicely, I'm going to murder his name, but George Luis Borges, it's probably Jorge, saying that the dictionary, the inventory, is based on a hypothesis, obviously an unproven one, that languages are made up of equivalent synonyms. And I'm going to explore this idea to kind of get across to an alternative view of communicative codes, where languages are in fact systems that are learned discriminatively in context. They're not memorized piecemeal. That, you know, a theory of language in which code is not compositional, but rather is learnt through the kind of learning mechanisms that we know brains and humans have, such that communication is a discriminative process, which again is kind of interesting because information theory itself defines a strongly, in fact, explicitly discriminative approach to thinking about communication. So I'm going to introduce some ideas. I don't have enough time to develop an argument, but rather what I'd like to do is just spin some plates and make people think about interesting things, and hopefully that's a helpful thing to do. So from this perspective, signals don't convey meanings. They serve to eliminate or reduce uncertainty about the context of messages, which have been learned as systems in context. And that the discriminative power, the information in code words, is distributed much more abstractly and efficiently across communicative signals than we tend to think. And I think this is actually what ultimately allows LLMs to work. So if we assume that symbols aren't grounded, but rather systems are, and this is obviously a difference between humans and language models, we learn language in the context of the world, they learn language in the context of other language. But I still think it's interesting, and I'll note some things as I go along about what that means for what get learned. And in particular, I think that what I'm going to try and illustrate is that a lot of times what people learn when they're learning language is far more abstract than we intuitively want to think. And I'm going to do this by thinking about a domain that seems about as unabstract as you can imagine, color words. So let's start with something about the way that children learn color words that I think is going to be interesting when we think about the abstraction in mental representation, and then when we think about the kinds of representations that models build up. Color words obviously do not seem abstract, and yet strangely enough, children are incredibly slow to learn them. The use of color words in children is haphazard and interchangeable, and as late as 4, children may fail to master color after hundreds of training trials. Now, this isn't obviously apparent all the time because lots of things, the color and the item, are so mutually predictable that kids will appear to be getting it right? So if you ask a kid what color a banana is, they'll tell you it's yellow. But of course, blind kids can tell you that a banana is yellow. Where kids get found out, and actually I mentioned Darwin there. Darwin was actually playing a game with his kids. And he was getting them to name objects on a tapestry. And he said, what color's an apple? They could say green or red. But he, you know, being the great scientist he was, he had this insight and he plucked threads from the tapestry and then had the kids name the color of the threads, and he discovered they couldn't do it, right? And so kids have a real problem generalizing the knowledge that they learn when they learn color. Now, they know the words and they use them in the correct part of speech, but their use is pretty random. And at the heart of human learning, and interestingly learning done by language models, is the delta rule, right? We learn through error. Sorry, my slides got a bit mixed up there because random things appeared on my screen. And if you think about learning using error-driven learning about color, it's kind of a weird problem, right? Because imagine that I hear and learn through standard error-driven learning mechanism the word red in a context. Well, I reinforce everything in the context. That's going to be the predictor of red. Then, and because color is ubiquitous, the environment's not very informative, I hear the word blue, then I'm going to unlearn red in this context, learn blue, and you can see that this is going to be a very inefficient way of learning. So years ago, I started to wonder about, well, how might language help this kind of learning? And if we play a game where we say, look at the duck, it's yellow, then if we use the kind of learning mechanisms that are in models and in humans, then what we will do is we'll reinforce all of the dimensions of that duck as a predictor of the word yellow that follows the word duck. Nice. In this world that we're now creating, it's a very helpful world because the duck has now been carefully photoshopped so as to retain every dimension except hue. We now say, look at the duck, it's red. And this is going to really be a fine environment to learn about color, right? Because we're going to eliminate all the ducky properties and we're going to hone in on the hue dimension that's a successful predictor of the lexical item. We're going to figure out the semantic association of the correlate in the world. Here's a problem. In English, we run around saying things like, look at the yellow duck. And the structure of the environment, I don't have time to get too deep into this, changes this. Right now, we have a single cue yellow that predicts a complex set of features. And any delta rule model that's learning this is simply going to learn the probability of the feature following the label. So now if we say, look at red duck, we're simply going to learn all the probabilities, right? And when it comes to the problem kids have with learning color, the difficulty they have is that look at the duck, it's yellow is going to facilitate error-driven learning. Look at the yellow duck is not. And most of what English-speaking kids hear is not look at the duck, it's yellow, it's look at the yellow duck. And I want you to hold that thought as we go along because it's going to be important. So based on this kind of random theoretical model many years ago with my colleagues, we gave kids a training study with 2.5-year-olds where we could either show kids a ball and say this ball is blue, or say this is a blue ball and show them the ball. And in very few trials, the discriminative paradigm allowed kids to discriminate, match colors to random objects. The blue ball did not. Right? That was kind of cool. I wrote a paper about it. It got published. It was all exciting. We talk about it. And as I roamed the country talking about this research, people would put their hand up and say, Ramscar, what about Spanish kids? And here's the basic problem, right? In English, we say the White House. In Spanish, you always have to say La Casa Blanca, right? And so what I would do when I was asked these questions is I'd sort of mumble things about distributions and I'd have to check the specifics of the language. And no, I don't want to commit that Spanish kids would definitely learn better than English kids. And obviously that made me sound a bit weak. So one day I decided I would sit down and use a corpus to actually try and get some distribution information to motivate these answers. And so I looked at the time, COCA was, this a long time ago, 450 million words, corpus contemporary American English, a Spanish corpus. So these are the frequencies per million in my Spanish corpus. Of course, Spanish is gendered, but we'll control for that in all the things we look at. It even has different words for purple. But I was quite astonished at how infrequent color words were in Spanish as compared to English. And why so different? Well, there are all sorts of popular ideas to explain these kinds of things in linguistics. Perhaps it's the culture. Perhaps we're looking at a Whorfian effect, right? We all know that Hispanic cultures are quite gray and drab and not very festive, where, of course, Anglo-Saxons, can't wait to party. No, it didn't seem very likely to me either. So what it got me thinking was back to Borges and maybe this whole idea that's kind of fundamental to a lot of ideas in linguistics, that languages comprise sets of equivalent synonyms, is kind of not on track. So remember that learning predicted, look at the duck is yellow is going to be good for learning meaning, yellow duck, not so much. If I went back and just looked at the kinds of constructions in which the color adjective followed the noun, suddenly the languages looked remarkably similar, to the extent that I would go, I think that kids are going to learn at about the same rate despite the language. Okay. So what's going on? I've been trying to start to move to this idea that meaning is much more abstract than people normally assume, and that language is set up to assist in prediction. And of course, we know that large language models get their power from essentially their ability to predict language in context. And the thing that I'm also going to move towards now is that these abstract structures can differ across languages, and that we can learn a lot about the nature of language from actually studying these differences. Now, noun systems are the most important parts of the grammar. And it turns out that the grammar of reference phrases is much more subtle and complex than people normally think, because people don't normally think about them in these predictive terms. And I'll try and illustrate that as I go along. So here's a sort of illustration of just the informativity of nouns. You can see that articles are relatively uninformative. Adverbs are more informative, but there, if you look at this, is a very large American, it's a sublex corpus. 60% of the word types in the sublex corpus are nouns. And as I'll show later, the problem is much worse than this. So the interesting thing about Spanish as compared to English is it's a gendered language. And traditionally, I could entertain you with hours of linguists saying amusing and derisory things about gender in language. I'm not going to. I'm just going to point out that gender is obviously derided as functionless, and yet from a communicative predictive perspective, it has an obvious function, right? Spanish articles convey more information about nouns than do English articles. In English, if I say yesterday I visited the market, then any noun can follow the. In Spanish, by contrast, as soon as I say el for el mercado, then there's only a subset of nouns that can follow. So Spanish articles obviously convey more information about English articles. It may be that the reason English color adjectives are more informative or more frequent is because they're actually filling some of that gap. But the problem, addressing it from this perspective, of course, is that Spanish adjectives are nominal post-nominal. What we'd want to do is to compare two languages which allow adjectives prenominally as content words, but simultaneously have informative gendered articles. And so an obvious comparison in which we can do this is comparing German and English. Both allow similar use of prenominal adjectives, but German articles convey a lot of grammatical information. English do not. So just to summarize in previous work, for brevity's sake, in previous work with Richard Futrell and Melody Dye and colleagues, we've shown that German articles are more informative about nouns than English articles, as you might expect given that example, but also the English adjectives provide more information in noun phrases than do German adjectives. But let's get specific and return to color words, because what we're interested in a sense, is this level of abstraction in which information is encoded. So to start off with, if my story about the functionality of pronominal adjectives in English is correct, it leads to some obvious predictions. The first is that just as we saw in Spanish and English, we should expect that English color words are more frequent than German color words. So just to clue you in on this, this is a log linear plot. So we've got a frequency of color words here. This is German. They're log frequencies, and these are going to be matched for frequency, that's the frequency per million, and their frequency rank. You can see that on average, German color words occur 64 times per million words of text. By contrast, English color words appear 80 million times per context, and the difference there is significant. However, if I'm right about the idea that what English color words are doing is they're making up for some of the communicative function of German, then we should expect that these differences should only be observable in prenominal adjectives, and exactly as we saw with Spanish, and the use of adjectives for other purposes would be the same. So here's the prenominal frequency differences. As you can see, English uses significantly more prenominal color adjectives than German. However, when it comes to other uses, the frequencies are essentially the same, right? So the difference, there is this difference, it's not some cultural thing, it seems to be something to do with making nouns more predictable. So what does this tell us about what gets learned? Because remember, what I'm trying to get you to think about is the levels of abstraction, you know, a standard criticism of language models is they don't understand meaning. And what I'd like to sort of do in talking about human learning today is to make you wonder about some of the things we take for granted in that. So I said earlier that children learn color words late, right? They're only able to become able to integrate them in highly supportive contexts, whatever that means about learning in the third year. Otherwise, they tend to just listen through color words, right? Experiments which, you know, look at eye tracking to guide lexical access. Kids will just ignore color words if you have a red car and a blue car, really until quite late. So our next move, how color words are used in child-directed speech and in German. So now we're going to look at just going to show you the prenominal frequencies in English and German. Here's German, as you'd expect. English prenominal frequencies are higher. Just an interesting thing for those of you who are interested. This is a log linear plot. A straight line on this is an exponential distribution. And in an exponential, you can actually tell entropy differences from the slope. So we can see here that English color adjectives are conveying more information than German. What you may not have noticed, but I want to draw your attention to, are the frequencies there. It's not just that they're slightly more frequent than in adult speech. In child-directed speech, before kids can understand these words, they are massively more frequent. So kids can't use them meaningfully, and they're overwhelmingly prenominal in child-directed speech. So this raises a question of how color words are used in child-directed speech as compared to adult speech. So what we then looked at was whether child-directed speech is more literal. So this is German and English. We're looking at the percent of observation of color adjectives and their use. And we're chopping them up into whether they're used literally, pass me the blue mug, as a proper name. I know, maybe a bar called the Golden Lion or something, fixed phrases and metaphors. It's a Blue Monday, right? And you can see that actually English and German use in adult speech, you know, color words are actually not used that often that literally, right? It's about 30%. This is how they're used in child-directed speech, right? Overwhelmingly, we use color words literally to kids at the point that they cannot understand them, right? So why? Well, one of the answers could be that communication with children tends to be highly embedded in context, right? It's a surprising but true finding that child-directed speech words are harder to identify out of context than adult speech words are. With kids, we tend to be talking, you know, look at the blue bottle, look at the green teddy, right? Whereas adults tend to be talking out of context. Yet, despite the fact kids don't understand them, adults are using lots of color words, look at the blue bottle, to kids that have no idea what blue is. So how does all this seemingly wasted effort help them to learn to communicate? Well, my hypothesis I've been sort of exploring here is that grammar is more abstract than you think, and what's learned is more abstract, so that color words probably don't work the way you think either. So the thing about color words is even when kids don't understand them, they do convey information. If a kid has a brown jacket and some blue pants, then you can get information about the upcoming noun from brown and blue, regardless of whether you know the meaning of brown and blue, right? And it turns out this is remarkably similar to the function that gendered articles have, right? And this, of course, is what pushes us through to a notion, and this is the notion of abstraction in linguistic representations, that articles are normally thought of as function words, and color adjectives are normally thought of as content words. But when we look at it at this level of granularity that kids are operating on, then it doesn't seem their function is different at all. And, you know, again, spinning a plate, what does this tell us about the nature of communicative knowledge in humans and large language models? So far, I've been talking about nouns are the least predictable part of speech, and gender and adjectives can make them more predictable. I want now to really push home, because I think most people don't really get this, just how hard it is to predict nouns in speech. So let's take an average corpus. This is actually a plot derived from the corpus of contemporary American English. In most corpuses, if we look at types and tokens, then around 100 to 150, depending on the size of the corpus, word types will account for almost half of the tokens in a typical corpus, right? But it turns out that there are a lot of word types in languages. And to illustrate just how much, there was a paper that came out 10 years ago now in Science from a team at Harvard that decided they would estimate the total lexicon of all words, including proper nouns in English, in the year 2000. And they happened upon the number 1,022,000 words, which is a lot, you'd say. Of course, if you'd gone and asked the people at the US Census how many proper nouns there were as surnames in the United States in 2000, they'd have said, thanks for asking, Ramscar, 6,248,415, right? Which is a lot more than 1,022,000. I'm going to explain why this is so hard to estimate next, right? English has a lot of nouns, like a lot of nouns, as we've just seen from that example. And a problem with word occurrences is that word occurrences are bursty. And unfortunately, people don't really integrate this into their thinking when they come to think about language. I'm going to assume that at least some of the audience has never heard the word bursty. And that's kind of helpful, right? Because it really helps to explain what burstiness is. If we look at average probabilities, the kinds of things that we would extract from the corpus, people tend to think that average probabilities equate to, average frequencies equate to probabilities. But it's actually empirically the case that if we take most words, the word bursty for most of you had a 0 probability in your lives up until now. When a word actually appears in context, the likelihood that word will reappear is actually hundreds of orders of 100 times more likely than its average frequency would predict. And what this actually means, surprisingly, is that corpus probabilities are meaningless for estimating the likely, so corpus frequencies, sorry, are useless at estimating the likelihoods of words in context. So I want to introduce you, to get back onto the topic, of some work I've been doing to examine whether language users are sensitive to burstiness. In other words, when we speak language, are we sensitive to the idea when we encounter a word, actually its likelihood of recurrence once it's occurred is dramatically higher than we might think given its average frequencies. Now, there's some support from this from dialogue studies, right? And old studies of dyads will show that if you are talking about random shapes like this, you might use a long reference phrase initially. When you get feedback that people have understood the reference phrase, you shorten your reference phrase, right? But obvious confound in terms of examining burstiness on this is its collaboration, you're getting feedback. So what we've designed is a paradigm to ask, what do people do without feedback, right? If people are using, say, adjectives in reference phrases to make nouns more predictable, and they're sensitive to burstiness, then what will they do if they're absolutely talking about things in the absence of a discourse partner? So this is kind of difficult stuff to do because it's spontaneous speech, but we come up with a paradigm we can get people to behave predictably. So what people will do is they'll see an initial array of stuff and they're told, you know, an interlocutor will later see this array, stuff is going to move around, and what they have to do is generate sentences that will allow someone later on to reproduce the movements, right? So what I'm showing you now is that what we see is initially when a noun is first mentioned, people will use adjectives about 25% of the time. They get no feedback, but then they have to generate the reference phrases again during the experiment. And so here's an example. This is, these are Snodgrass and Vandervoort pictures. The guy sees a brown eye looking straight at me. Many, many movements later, he then refers to it again, and he just refers to it as the eye, right? So initial introduction use an adjective, second doesn't. And so what we see is, as compared to subsequent mention, people use more adjectives to make these nouns more predictable in first mention, and then kind of evidence that they have these dynamic representations of probability, that they're sensitive to burstiness. They then are much less likely to use modified reference phrases later in discourse. This gets kind of cool, in fact. So this is another experiment. And in this experiment, we've got a different paradigm. People are asked, imagine a big red triangle, a small green square, and a large purple circle laid out in a line. In front of them is a small white mouse. Explain how the mice can go around them, right? So this is a typical sample response. This often happens a lot. People will repeat the thing. Quite often in the paradigm before, they'll describe the whole thing. They've already been told that people will see. They repeat it anyway. So first mention is a big red triangle. Then it's a red triangle, and we say approaching the red triangle, the mouse begins. It's a big red triangle, goes down to a triangle, red triangle, the red triangle, the triangle, right? So again, we see this sensitivity to predictable in context. Once something's given, once it's mentioned, despite the absence of feedback, you reduce the specificity of the noun because the nouns become more predictable by dint of it being mentioned. Here's the fun thing about this experiment. In this case, the participant is not a human subject. It was ChatGPT, right? So kind of try and stay on time. You asked me to speak for over half an hour. This leads, if we think about languages, as ultimately, I don't really like using the word prediction. Prediction's the mechanism, the function is uncertainty reduction, but of course, expectation goes hand in hand with uncertainty reduction. If human communication is based on structured uncertainty reduction, which I say is similar to predicting the next word, then if it's the case that the language models that people develop in order to communicate are something akin to the kind of models that at some level of abstraction are developed in LLMs, then we should expect to see this kind of supportive structure everywhere in language. And in fact, when we look and see it, then maybe they'll start to explain why it is that language models work so well, right? That people naturally produce this structure in discourse, in writing, because that's how language works. And so what I thought I'd do to close is we've looked at gender, which most linguists think is something that is a gewgaw in some ways. Here's a potted history of Western philosophy. For about 4,000 years, people would sit around, have a theory of how language works. Some would ask, well, how does that deal with personal names? The person would slap their forehead, throw their theory on the ground, and go and think about something else. In the mid-20th century, linguists came up with a genius idea. Why don't we just forget about them, right? Consign them to a small subfield called onomastics, which sounds a little bit like the kind of thing priests warned us against, and everybody else will just get on with explaining language, right? And what I'm going to close with is just showing you actually what personal names look like from a communicative perspective. So I'm going to have to do some clarifications because I want to do a cross-cultural comparison here to really show how general these things are in language. We're going to compare and I'm going to compare English and Chinese and Korean, but in fact, this basic comparison works between Western languages and East Asian cultural sphere languages. So here's, I think he's from Hong Kong, John Wu or Wu Yusen. I apologize to anybody that speaks anything like Chinese because I don't, so I just probably massacred that. And basically what you find is that John and Wu are drawn from very large sets, very small sets of items, and then the kind of things that modify names are pulled from very small sets. So if we look at East Asian names and in China and Korea, historically, you have about 100 prefix names, the things that begin names, and they're exponentially distributed, which means, in fact, about 80% of people shared 20 names, right? And often if you tell people that's still the case in Korea, Westerners will smile slightly. But this yields an informative hierarchy, right? Because we know that John is a very predictable prefix name in English, and we know that Wu is in Chinese. And so what we're essentially doing is we have lower uncertainty with these things, more uncertainty, more content, more discriminative power as we go along. So if you take my name, Michael is the most frequent name given to English-speaking males in the world. Ramscar, on the other hand, is quite good in terms of discriminating the identity of the individual we're talking about. So in communicative terms, East Asian prefix names are family names. In Western names, they're given names. But really, the functional equivalents, there are good historical reasons to believe that they are equivalent. For most of human history, people just had a given name, and then these given names tend to be flexibly modified by names. Legislation has changed this, right? In the Sinosphere, prefix names were turned into patronyms in about 400 BC. In Western names, in Western civilizations, bynames were turned into patronyms surprisingly recently, right? In some countries as late as the 1930s. If we look at Western prehistory, though, we find a very interesting thing. In the period between 1300 and 1800, 50% of English-speaking males and 50% of females had gender-appropriate names. English men were called John, William, and Thomas, and English women were called Elizabeth, Mary, and Anne. And at least statistically, we know that about 10 male and female names covered about 80% of the population. So to look at this kind of communicative structure, this in natural languages, even in places that we think are structuralists, what I did was initially to just take a historical set of names from Scotland. This is what we're looking at is all of the first names given in 4 counties in Scotland over a 100-year period, right? Everything given. And what's fine is we find that on average, in each of the communities, about 100 names, And they have this distribution on a log linear plot, which if I match it to an exponential distribution, you'll see is almost perfectly exponential, which of course is what has been reported for China and Korea. To make sure this isn't a one-off, took another distribution from Northern England from the same period, matched it to my Scottish distribution, and I hope everybody can see it's the same statistical distribution. What I'm doing now is plotting frequency controlled the distribution of Korean names in the 2000 Korean census and my Scottish distribution. And I hope you can all see it's the same statistical system, right? And what this means, if we look at this in information theoretic terms, is these codes are remarkably similar, right? Korean first names encode about 4.65 bits of information. It's 4.8 in Scotland and 4.77 in Durham and Northumberland, similar measures of perplexity. So what you see here is a nice exponential distribution in all of these cultures in which 80% of people have just one of 20 names. What is the function communicating with these distributions? Well, 20 names are easy to learn. If they're high frequency, they'll be sampled evenly. None of the problems of burstiness that you get with less frequent names. They'll be easily to process, and they'll allow first names to perform their grammatical function, right? Which is providing partial information that reduces uncertainty about unattested forms. If in historical England, I ask you, do you know John Zarjaj? Then even if you've never heard of that, you've learned something, right? You now know that there is an identity signaled it's a male by John that you don't know about but exists somewhere and you can learn more about. And of course, everything I've been showing you about noun distributions, about name distributions guarantee, as I say, that no one ever learns the full inventory of nouns in their language. We will constantly be encountering unattested forms. And what we've also been seeing is all languages actually have systems that basically give you partial information that makes these things more predictable. I'm going to close with the question that I think is kind of interesting and I think is kind of fun, and I'm going to have a little nod at the last question we're asked to think about. Why us people? Why is everything I've been talking about something that a lot of this will come as news to many linguists, right, and people who think about language? And I'm going to summarize this as why are people, and including language scientists, so bad at language statistics? And a concrete example that I think is kind of entertaining is that despite actual historical distributions, when people come to write fiction, they always give their characters unique first names. People are utterly insensitive to the distributions of names in reality, right? The massively high set of volumes that comprise Games of Thrones, it has 100 main characters, right? And in the whole volume, only 2 characters share a first name. So I wondered what would happen if I asked a large language model to produce a historically accurate list of characters that I would want to put in a novel set in the 1700s. So I asked for 100, I actually pushed this as far as I go. I ended up pushing for 100 male and 100 female names. I hope you can see that ChatGPT behaves exactly like the chap that wrote Game of Thrones or most novelists. Every name is unique, right? Of the 200 names, 200 male, 200 female I asked it to create, it created only 2 overlapping names. The desperately predictable names, Ignatius, right, actually was given to 2 characters. Here's a fun thing. I then asked ChatGPT to produce a list of real famous people from the 1700s. So an interesting, the model now stepped outside of its model and searched the web. And this is what it produced, right? It turns out that, again, confirming what I've shown you so far, in the empirical distribution, 80% of people shared these first names, and there were very, very few of these low frequency names, right? Now, back to burstiness. Another way of illustrating burstiness is, of all those millions of American surnames, right? Most people have never heard of any of them. That's why it's so hard to just randomly decide, I'm going to decide what is a word or not in language. But for anybody who owns those names, or of anybody who knows those people, those go from 0 probability words to high probability words, right? And what we see is this distribution across language. And of course, if anybody with a rare name has a nice predictable prefix name, like I'm called Michael, right? Then you immediately know, if you've never heard Ramscar before, or these other names, what you're dealing with, right? And this is this whole notion of partial information that we see in real grammars, but not necessarily in fiction. And of course, one of the problems with large language models, which I think leads to the result I've just shown you, is that a lot of what they're trained on will be fiction. So I'm going to close now with my answer to the second question, what might happen in human writers' minds as they collaborate with AI? Well, perhaps it depends on whether they interact directly, make me a list of characters, or whether, in fact, scientists interacting with large language models, thinking about language theory, actually help to change our understanding of language. It's not a rule-based system, it's a probabilistic system. It's a highly structured probabilistic system, such that authors might start to think about these kind of questions before they decide, I think I'll just give everybody a random name. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.